Thank you, Joe. I'm delighted to be back here. A quick bit of background before I begin about the genesis of this talk. Back in 2023, I served as a consultant for a special exhibit at the Mark Twain House in Hartford, and it was called For Business or Pleasure, Mark Twain's Summer Sojourns. The exhibit focused on the concept of a working vacation, examining a series of places like Onteora, New York, and a cabin on Lower Saranac Lake in the Adirondacks, where Mark Twain could both relax and carve out time for sustained concentration on his latest literary endeavor. The exhibit got me thinking about the conditions that were most conducive to the expression of his creativity and led to, to this research. So this is a delicate balance, work and play, in Mark Twain's creative process. In November 1905, on the eve of his 70th birthday, Mark Twain was interviewed by a reporter from the New York Times. As the men conversed, he astonished the journalist by declaring that despite having written and published more than 20 books over the course of his career, he was essentially a lazy man who had never done a day's work. And there you can see. No, sir, not a day's work in all my life. What I have done because it has been play. If it had been work, I shouldn't have done it. The dichotomy Twain proposes here between work and play merits some investigation, since as anyone who has stared forlornly at a blank computer screen trying to write a college essay due the next morning knows, writing is indeed hard work, grinding, nerve-wracking, stressful work, at least for most of us. For Mark Twain, the concept of work was closely correlated with physical exertion, whereas intellectual labor, the exercise of one's mind or imagination, was deemed a source of pleasure and hence play. As he explains in A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, intellectual work is misnamed. It is a pleasure, a dissipation, and its own highest reward. The poorest paid architect, engineer, general, author, sculptor, painter, lecturer, advocate, legislator, actor, preacher, singer is constructively in heaven when he is at work. And as for the magician with the fiddle bow in his hand who sits in the midst of a great orchestra with the ebbing and flowing tides of divine sound washing over him, why certainly he is at work, if you wish to call it that. But Lord, it's a sarcasm just the same. This distinction between work and play is brilliantly illustrated in the iconic scene in Tom Sawyer when Aunt Polly punishes Tom for playing hooky by making him whitewash her fence on a glorious Saturday morning. Tom, however, subverts her plan by devising a clever scheme to get others to do the chore for him by pretending it's fun and charging them for the privilege to boot. By the end of the morning, the fence gleams with 3 coats of fresh whitewash, and Tom has amassed a hoard of treasure. At this point, Mark Twain informs the reader, Tom had discovered a great law of human action without knowing it, namely that in order to make a man or boy covet a thing, it is only necessary to make the thing difficult to attain. If he had been a wise and great philosopher, like the writer of this book, he would now have comprehended that work consists of whatever a body is obliged to do, and that play consists of whatever a body is not obliged to do. For me, the key word in this quote is the verb oblige, to be legally or morally bound to perform a certain task or action. In Tom Sawyer's case, the source of this obligation is obvious, the parental authority embodied in Aunt Polly. But in Mark Twain's professional life, the question of exactly to whom or what he was obliged is more complicated. More often than not, he was under contract with a publisher to produce a certain number of words by a specific date, external forces or obligations which theoretically should have stifled his creativity, but typically did not. In an autobiographical dictation on August 30th, 1906, Twain described his manner of writing and the mysterious source of his creativity as follows. As long as a book would write itself, I was a faithful and interested amanuensis, and my industry did not flag. But the minute that book tried to shift to my head, the labor of contriving its situations, inventing its adventures, and conducting its conversations, I put it away and dropped it out of my mind. It was by accident that I found out that a book is pretty sure to get tired along about the middle and refuse to go on with its work until its powers and its interest should have been refreshed by a rest and its depleted stock of raw materials reinforced by lapse of time. It was when I had reached the middle of Tom Sawyer that I made this invaluable find. At page 400 of my manuscript, the story made a sudden and determined halt and refused to proceed another step. I knew quite well that the tale was not finished, and I could not understand why I was not able to go on with it. The reason was very simple. My tank had run dry. It was empty. The stock of materials in it was exhausted. The story could not go on without materials. It could not be wrought out of nothing. It was then that I made the great discovery that when the tank runs dry, you've only to leave it alone and it will fill up again in time while you are asleep. Also, while you are at work on other things and are quite unaware that this unconscious and profitable cerebration is going on. There was plenty of material now, and the book went on and finished itself without any trouble. Mark Twain's famous description of his tank, an unconscious wellspring of inspiration that he effortlessly taps into, channels through his pen and out onto the page, placing himself in the position of a mere scribe or amanuensis, closely aligns with psychiatrist Carl Jung's notion of an extroverted creator. This type of artist experiences the creative process not as a willful act of volition, but rather as a spontaneous, immersive flood of thoughts and images. According to Jung, an extroverted artist is, quote, subordinate to his or her work, or stands outside of it as though he were a second person, unquote. Or, in Mark Twain's analogy, an amanuensis. Once a book shifted to his head, meaning to deliberate conscious control, it ceased to be play and became labor, and the tank of inspiration would inevitably run dry. This theory of creativity is fundamentally optimistic, grounded in a belief that the imagination is an inexhaustible resource. Given patience and time, it will replenish itself, as Twain says, while you're asleep, also while you're at work on other things, and are quite unaware that this is taking place. Clemens made much the same argument to the Anglican minister George Bainton in response to an 1888 inquiry about his methods of composition. Doubtless, I have methods, but they begot themselves, in which case I am only their proprietor, not their father. He refers to an automatically working taste, a taste which selects and rejects without asking you for any help, and patiently and steadily improving itself without troubling you to approve or applaud. Yes, and likely enough, when the structure is at last pretty well up and attracts attention, you feel complimented, whereas you didn't build it and didn't even consciously superintend. As in the 1906 autobiographical dictation, Mark Twain characterizes creativity as external and apart, the product of a mysterious automatic process that he appreciates but does not fully comprehend and certainly not control. Early on in his career, Clemens could write anywhere, oblivious to distraction, physical discomfort, and a lack of privacy. Excuse me. As his Quaker City roommate Dan Sloat recalled some years after the 1867 cruise, Mark Twain's work ethic and focus on that journey were nothing short of remarkable. When we were out on the Holy Land expedition, he was the hardest working man I ever saw. Why, out in Egypt, where the fleas were so thick you couldn't breathe without swallowing 1,000, That man used to sit up and write half the night. I used to have to go get my clothes off in a second and hustle into bed before any of the fleas had a chance to get between the sheets. And as I was vainly trying to get to sleep, I'd say to Clemens, "Sam, how the deuce can you stand it to write out there among the fleas?" "Oh, I'm all right," Sam would say. "They've got a railroad track eaten around both ankles, and they keep in that pretty much, so I don't bother with them." In early 1868, during his brief tenure as a secretary to Nevada Senator William Stewart, Clemens revised and expanded his original travel letters to the Alta California to produce The Innocents Abroad. He worked in the cramped quarters where he lived, a rented room in a Washington, D.C. boarding house. According to one of his fellow lodgers, the conditions in which he wrote were chaotic, filled with dirt, disarray, and of course, a thick haze of tobacco smoke. This squalor did not impede his creativity. Actually, it seemed to fuel it. There was Mark Twain in a little back room with a sheet iron stove, a dirty, musty carpet of the cheapest description, a bed, and 2 or 3 common chairs. The little drum stove was full of ashes, running over on the zinc sheet. The bed seemed to be unmade for a week. The slops had not been carried out for a fortnight. The room was foul with tobacco smoke. The floor, dirty enough to begin with, was littered with newspapers from which Twain had cut his letters. Then there were hundreds of pieces of torn manuscripts which had been written and then rejected by the author. A dozen pipes were about the apartment. On the washstand, on the mantle, on the writing table, on the chairs, everywhere that room could be found. And there was tobacco, and tobacco everywhere. One thing, there were no flies. The smoke killed them, and I am now surprised the smoke did not kill me, too. He would strip down to his suspenders, his coat and vest, of course, being off, and walk back and forth in slippers in his little room and swear and smoke the whole day long. Of course, at times he did work, and when he did work, it was like a steam engine at full head. Illustrator, True Williams, visualized the writer's composition process in Mark Twain's Memories, featured in the opening chapter of his 1880 travelogue, A Tramp Abroad. Books and papers, as you can see, lie discarded around the writer's feet, alongside a pipe and a pair of grotesquely oversized scissors. But what I like best about this image is the almost dizzying swirl of landscapes, figures, and objects around the image's frame, with Mark Twain himself bent over his desk in shirt sleeves at the center of a pulsating imaginative vortex. There's one other detail also worth noting. The writer is wearing slippers, suggesting an analogy between physical comfort and creativity. As William Dean Howells noted in his memoir, My Mark Twain, Clemens always preferred slippers to shoes at home. He carried them along on his travels as well, donning slippers when visiting his friend in Cambridge and putting on a pair of rubbers over them for their rambles in the city. As Howells reflects, Clemens reveled in both the sheer lawlessness of this eccentric habit and the couple's, quote, delight in allowing him to indulge it. Once Clemens's bachelor days ended, finding the time, space, and most importantly, the inspiration to write became more of a challenge. He composed Roughing It under extremely difficult personal circumstances: a premature baby, a sickly wife, and a continuous parade of doctors, nurses, and caregivers invading the sanctum of his home. Perhaps not surprisingly, his tank would not cooperate, as he confided to Mary Mason Fairbanks a few weeks after his wedding, causing him to feel like a draft horse straining to pull a burdensome load. Every day, I nerve myself and seize my pen and dispose my paper and prepare to buckle on the harness and work. And then I pace the floor, back and forth with vacuous mind. And finally, I lay down the pen and confess that my time has not come, that I am utterly empty. But I must work, and I will work. I will go straight at it and force it. I used to do it every day of my life between Gibraltar and the Bermudas, and of course it can be done again. And it was so hard then. Will it be so now? Worse, maybe. Beleaguered by the pressures of a looming deadline for his manuscript, he told his publisher, Elisha Bliss, in March 1871, out of the infernal, damnable chaos I am whirling in at home, I snatch a moment to reply. In 3 months, 3 whole months, I have hardly written a page of manuscript. You do not know what it is to be in a state of absolute frenzy, desperation. I had rather die twice over than repeat the last 6 months of my life. A few years later, Mark Twain discovered the ideal conditions in which his creativity could thrive, thanks to his sister-in-law, Susan Crane, who in the spring of 1874 surprised him with the gift of an airy hillside study right here at Quarry Farm. This is the earliest known photo of the study, taken by Elmira photographer Elisha Van Aken on the 29th of July, 1874, showing how the area had been clear-cut during construction, allowing sweeping views of the valley below and the mountains to the south. If you look very closely through the window, a figure, doubtlessly Mark Twain, can be seen seated at a desk. Here is a stereograph of a study, as seen through the vine-clad arches of an arbor situated further up the hillside that was taken on the same day. A second image of the building's interior shows a carefully posed image of the writer at work. Within a few years of the study's completion, as Clara Clemens remembered, this charming sort of Peter Pan house grew covered with ivy and surrounded with beautiful wildflowers and morning glories, as illustrated in this photo taken in the 1880s. In a June 1874 letter to his Hartford minister, Joseph Twitchell, Twain rhapsodized, "Susan Crane has built the loveliest study for me you ever saw. It is octagonal with a peaked roof, each octagon filled with a spacious window, and it sits perched in complete isolation on top of an elevation that commands leagues of valley and city and retreating ranges of distant blue hills. It is a cozy nest with just room in it for a sofa and a table and 3 or 4 chairs. And when the storms sweep down the remote valley and the lightning flashes above the hills beyond and the rain beats upon the roof over my head, imagine the luxury of it." As this quote suggests, the study's lofty elevation and the opportunity thus afforded for reverie was integral to its magic. "Perched away up here on top of the hill near heaven," he told his Hartford attorney, Charles Perkins, "I have the feeling of being sort of a scrub angel and am more moved to help shove the clouds around and get the stars on deck properly and keep all things trim and ship-shape in the firmament than to bother myself with the humble insect interests and occupations of the distant earth." That September, Twain offered another description of his working habits in a letter to his Scottish friend, Dr. John Brown. "On hot days, I spread the study wide open, anchor my papers with brickbats, and write in the midst of the hurricanes, clothed in the same thin linen we make shirt bosoms of. The study is nearly on the peak of the hill. It is right in front of the little arbor roofed with bark and covered with the vine you call the American creeper. It's green, already bloodied with red. The study is 30 yards below the old arbor and 100 yards above the dwelling house. It is remote from all noises. Comfortably dressed, braced by the exhilarating tonic of fresh air swirling around him, remote from all noises other than birdsong and rustling leaves, These were the optimal conditions for Mark Twain to exercise his creative genius. And thrive it did. Writing to his mother in July 1883 about his progress on Huckleberry Finn, he said, "I haven't had such booming working days for many years. I am piling up manuscript in a really astonishing way. I believe I shall complete in 2 months a book I have been fooling over for 7 years. This summer, it is no more trouble for me to write than it is to lie." The painstaking, often grueling process of revision, which is altogether beyond the scope of this talk, would come later. What I find most intriguing about Mark Twain's Quarry Farm study, however, is not its relative isolation or the bucolic vistas that it afforded, but rather its balance between solitude and sociability. The writer's habit of sharing his latest work with his family on the porch each night after dinner and gauging its success on the basis of their response is, of course, well known. He was not sequestered in a garret, cut off from all human contact, but paradoxically apart and simultaneously enmeshed in the fabric of community. That, in essence, I think, was Mark Twain's sweet spot. Twain's solitary flights of imagination were tempered, and I would argue sustained, by re-immersion in the realm of domesticity, where the products of his pen were translated into the dynamic, interactive medium of storytelling. Clemence's niece, Ida Langdon, recalls that when Mark Twain was writing The Prince and the Pauper, he welcomed interruptions from his daughters, sometimes accompanied by their cousins and friends, who would, quote, by prearrangement, come trooping silently into the quiet zone maintained around the little octagon late in the afternoon. If he were ready for them, he would call out. Sometimes they were not on the spot, and he blew a horn for them. And in breathless excitement, they would gather around him on the study steps to hear the newest chapter of this story that they passionately loved. The idyllic conditions of Quarry Farm were so conducive, and indeed so essential to Mark Twain's creativity, that he literally sought to replicate them in other locations. In April 1878, the Clemens family left Hartford for a 16-month stay in Europe, living in Germany, Italy, and France. They arrived in Heidelberg on May 6th and took a suite of rooms at the Schloss Hotel, just adjacent to the magnificent castle ruins on a steep hill above the city. So this is an illustration from A Tramp Abroad. Almost immediately, right, and there's a contemporary image from the Schloss Hotel, which has been converted into condos, sad to say. Really expensive condos. Almost immediately, Mark Twain rented a, quote, writing den across the Neckar River to create some distance between what he termed home attractions and distractions. Within a few short weeks, however, he grew dissatisfied because, as he explained to his Hartford friend, Charles Dudley Warner, it was no exercise to trot down there, and the exercise of climbing up here was valueless because I got it at the wrong end of the day. It was lonesome, too, and too far removed from beer. In other words, walking down, if you've not ever been to Heidelberg, it's a very hilly place, and the castle is up at the crest of the hill. So to get to this rented space, he has to go down, right, and then back up at the end of the day. In other words, walking down to his place of work and then back up to the hotel at the end of the day inverted the rhythm which he had grown accustomed to in Elmira. His remedy? A new space, rented on June 4th. I mean, don't you think that's funny? I mean, he'd already paid the rent. It's like, nope, not gonna work, right? This just isn't, taking me to the zone where I need to be. So a new space rented on June 4th, as indicated in this page from his notebook. And he described this new space in detail a few pages later in that same letter that I already referenced to Charles Dudley Warner. I have moved my den clear up on the very pinnacle of the Kaiserstuhl, 1,400 or 1,500 feet up in the air above the Schloss Hotel, and 1,700 above the Rhine Valley, which it overlooks. I have the only room in a little Wirtschaft they're not lived in by the family. I start to climb the mountain every morning about 10 or a little after. I loaf along the steep sides, cogitating and smoking, rest occasionally, and peer out through the ragged windows and the dense foliage upon the fair world below. Then trudge further to another resting place, always with an attentive ear to the pleasant woodland sounds, the manifold music of the birds, and finally reach my den around noon, feeling pretty gorgeous and at peace with the world. I treat myself to a blast of the summit breeze and a 5 minutes contemplation of the great Rhine Plains, slumbering sea of mottled tints and shades, and then shut myself up tight and fast in my noiseless den and go to work. About 4 p.m., I take beer and listen to the family's domestic news, or get one of the young girls to pilot me through some conjugations and declensions, or hold the book while I curse the dative case. Then about 5 or 5:15, I go loafing down the mountain again, find Livy and Clara in the castle park, and listen to the band in the shadow of the ruin. I just want to pause here for a second. You know, this is a private letter, and it's so beautiful, it's so literary, it's so rich. You know, I mean, this is just, he's just rambling, you know, I mean, he's not consciously thinking about, you know, I'm writing literature here. He's just writing to a friend, and it's actually quite poetic, isn't it? Yeah. Notice the similarity of Mark Twain's language in describing the environs of his Heidelberg workspace to earlier letters about the Quarry Farm study. Sweeping views of a river valley, peering through dense foliage out onto the fair world below, the blast of the summit breeze, and peaceful woodland sounds. Indeed, he was so charmed by this new location that he also discussed it in a letter to Bayard Taylor, who was then serving as the US minister to Prussia. Yes, we still live at the Schloss Hotel, and shall doubtless continue to do so until the neighborhood of August. But I only eat and sleep there. My work den is on the second story of a little Wirtschaft, which stands at the base of the tower on the summit of the Königstuhl. That's the proper name of the mountain. He called it the Kaiserstuhl in the earlier letter, but no matter. I walk up there every morning at 10, right until 3, talk the most hopeless and unimprovable German with the family until 5, then tramp down to the hotel for the night. It is a sehr schönes Aussicht, a very beautiful view. Up there, as you may remember, the exercise of climbing up there is invigorating, but devilish. An unpublished story in the Mark Twain papers, dated June 6, 1878, and tentatively titled The Lost Earring by Albert Bigelow Paine, Mark Twain's first biographer, is set at the Königstuhl Wirtschaft and reveals its inevitable shortcoming in comparison to Quarry Farm. Though this cozy nest undeniably offered the requisite distance and separation from his family, its sociability was a bit more than the writer had bargained for. Occupying the only room on the premises that was not inhabited by the owners, he lacked the privacy of his Elmira study and was therefore prone to diversion and distraction. Arriving to work one morning soon after the rental began, he found himself irresistibly drawn in to an intimate domestic drama unfolding in real time among 3 generations of the household's women. I reached, there we go, okay. I reached the little house on the peak of the Königstuhl this morning, about 11. As I stepped into the small living room, Fräulein Marie stepped into the same room from the kitchen. Her head was down. She raised it and showed such a heartbroken face. Her eyes were dim with tears, which she was trying hard to keep from flowing. The mother, the two sisters, the good old stocking knitter, and I all sprang forward with one impulse and one exclamation of distress and sympathy. "Oh, child, what has happened?" She could not speak, but she touched one of her earrings with her forefinger and laid her other forefinger eloquently upon the remains of the other, and her tale was told. 2/3 of the pendant was broken off and lost. They were simple jewels, these earrings, and had not cost what a lady pays for a pair of kid gloves in America. But they were precious to the owner, for she was not rich in such things. Although an outsider in terms of his class, nationality, and gender, the narrator vicariously shares in the pain of Marie's experience. Yet, mindful of his professional responsibilities, he politely extricates himself from the conversation and hurries off to his upstairs room. My work was urgent, so I went upstairs and set myself at it. But I could get no life into it. This house was a house of mourning, and there was no getting away from the sense of it. To argue that nothing was the matter, except that an almost costless trifle had been lost, was an easy thing to do, but it did no good after it was done. There was no arguing away the fact that the only real thing about affliction is the affliction itself. The cause of it is not a thing to be considered. The loss of a king's crown and a young girl's trinket weigh just the same in the scales of the angel of calamity. These lines offer an important insight into Mark Twain's creative sensibility, his keen and absorptive receptivity of mind, soaking in all facets of the life around him. He fails to get life into his pages because the immediacy of Fräulein Marie's affliction dominates and, in fact, overrides his pre-existing intentions, which seem dull and abstract in comparison. The writer philosophically interrogates the nature of the distraction, realizing that all afflictions weigh just the same in the scales of the angel of calamity. After 3 hours of futile chair time, I judged that I had worked enough. So I went downstairs and struck into the road which leads through the beech wood. The old stocking knitter was in her usual nook among the trees, plying her needles. The face bent over the work was sorrowful, so I knew that the season of mourning still continued. Just as he turns to leave, however, Fräulein Marie triumphantly reappears with a radiant face, holding up the glittering object and never uttering a word. She then explains that the missing piece of her earring had fallen into her apron pocket, to which the old stocking knitter replies, "The ways of God are wonderful." The story concludes with this line: "My friend, the reader, is privileged to imagine for himself what the rejoicing in the homestead was like when we all ran thither. It is beyond my art to paint it." And yet, ironically, the story's very existence demonstrates that it was not at all beyond Mark Twain's ability to capture or paint the day's dramatic events. This unpublished work, among countless others at the Mark Twain Papers, reveals another facet of the writer's creative process, namely that any incident, no matter how random or apparently insignificant, could be profitably seized for its literary potential. Although Mark Twain may not have made any progress on the manuscript of A Tramp Abroad that day, as he intended, his time, energy, and imagination were by no means squandered. In the years following his Heidelberg experience, Mark Twain sought out other rented quarters where he could spend the summer writing, Onteora and Saranac Lake, New York, as well as Dublin, New Hampshire, to name just a few. As he explained to his New York Times interviewer in 1905, "I have tried a number of summer homes here and in Europe. Each of these homes had charms and delights of its own, And some of them, even in Europe, had conveniences too. They all had a view. And this kind of harkens back to the line in his 1878 letter to Bayard Taylor, right, about the sehr schönes Aussicht. It is my conviction that there should always be some water in a view. The Chemung River, right? A lake or a river, but not the ocean if you are down on its level. I think when you are down on its level, it seldom inflames you with an ecstasy which you could not get out of a sand flat. And again, continuing with Mark Twain's quote, the summer homes are high perched as a rule and have contenting outlooks. The house we occupy in Dublin, New Hampshire has one. Monadnock, a soaring double hump, rises into the sky at its left elbow. That is to say, it is close at hand. From the base of the long slant of the mountain, the valley spreads away to the circling frames of hills, and beyond the frame, the billowy sweep of remote great ranges rise to view and flow fold upon fold, wave upon wave, soft and blue and unworldly to the horizon 50 miles away. The backdrop of this 1906 photo of the writer seated, seated on the porch of his Dublin house provides a vague sense of the soft, blue, unworldly vista that enchanted him. However, this contemporary shot conveys its scale more powerfully. Mark Twain's intuitive understanding of natural beauty as a stimulus to creativity proved prescient. In 1995, psychologists Rachel and Stephen Kaplan published a study called The Experience of Nature, in which they advanced a concept called attention restoration theory, proposing that mental fatigue can be alleviated and concentration can be improved by time spent observing nature. Their theory is grounded in the work of 19th century American philosopher William James, whose pioneering 1890 study, The Principles of Psychology, Mark Twain had read and greatly admired. The two men met in Florence in 1892, corresponded with one another, and maintained an active friendship until their respective deaths in 1910. While Twain unfortunately left no record regarding his response to the Principles of Psychology, it is tempting to speculate whether James's distinction between two types of attention, the involuntary kind, which is passive, unconscious, and effortless, and voluntary or directed attention, which involves considerable intellectual effort and focus to maintain one's concentration. Perhaps these would have resonated with Mark Twain on some kind of intuitive level. Building on James's concept of attention, the Kaplans hypothesized that for a natural scene to produce a restorative effect, it must possess four distinct qualities. First of all, it must have what they call extent, meaning that an environment is rich enough and coherent enough to engage the mind by constituting a whole other world. Secondly, the scene must induce an impression of, quote, being away. In other words, offer an escape or a reprieve from habitual activity. Third, the third Kaplan criteria is compatibility, meaning that an observer feels intimately connected with his or her environment rather than alienated or apart from it. Lastly, and most importantly, the scene must elicit what they call soft fascination, effortless immersion in some aspect of the natural setting, such as billowing clouds, the fluttering of leaves, the colors of the sunset. And that's when this psychic rejuvenation takes place. With these characteristics in mind, please think back to Mark Twain's 1874 description of his Quarry Farm study. Excuse me. It sits perched in complete isolation on top of an elevation that commands leagues of valley and city and retreating ranges of distant blue hills. When the storms sweep down the remote valley and the lightning flashes above the hills beyond, and the rain beats upon the roof over my head. Imagine the luxury of it. Extent, the Kaplan's first criteria, check, right? Being away, above it all, check. Compatibility, check. And soft fascination, check. In this respect, the writer's words almost uncannily anticipate the 20th century construct of attention restoration theory. In the final years of his life, Mark Twain discovered that the ultimate cozy nest for reverie and creation was his bed. This practice, as he explained to the Times reporter, originated in a bout of illness. Whenever I've got some work to do, I go to bed. I got into that habit some time ago when I had an attack of bronchitis. Suppose your bronchitis lasts 6 weeks. The first 2, you can't do much but attend to the barking. But the last 4, I found I could work if I stayed in bed. Work in bed is a pretty good gospel, at least for a man who's come like me to the time of life when his blood is easily frosted. Oops, sorry. Okay. If you're sitting at a desk, you get excited about what you're doing. And the first thing you know, the steam heat or the furnace has raised the temperature until you've almost got a fever. Or the fire in the grate goes out and you get a chill. Or if somebody comes in to attend the fire, he interrupts you and gets you off the trail of that idea you were pursuing. And so I go to bed. I can keep an equable temperature there without trying and go on about my work without being bothered. Ever the provocateur, Mark Twain invited photographers into his private sanctum on Fifth Avenue in New York. And the following 3 images, which were all taken on the same occasion in early 1906, appeared in a journal called the Literary Digest on April 28th. Interestingly, not in a feature about Mark Twain, but as illustrations accompanying an article on the Russian writer Maxim Gorky, who was then visiting New York on a Bolshevik fundraising trip, with whom Twain was very briefly allied, and then there was a falling out between them. The incongruity between these images and the captions assigned to them is telling in terms of the writer's concepts of work and play. Portrayed in comfortable repose, clad only in pajamas, propped up against his snowy bed pillows and smoking a cigar, surrounded by all manner of accoutrements, pipes, newspapers, books, writing utensils, and, if I'm not mistaken, a carafe of whiskey as well. This, the reader is informed, is, quote, how Mark Twain works. Here, pen in hand, notebook propped up on his knee, he is allegedly waiting for a word. And lastly, he's simply at work. Soon after the issue's publication, Clemens received a letter from a stranger, Thomas Miranda, who told him, I do not know if you noticed the optical illusion in the photo of yourself published in the Digest some weeks ago. I have marked it, and it represents a little child whispering in your ear as you write. If this is the illusion, and in truth, the truth, then it is no wonder that your writings are liked by all. Surely anyone who is inspired by the whisperings of a child can write only that which is good for the soul. Intrigued, Clemens immediately contacted Clara and requested, if any of these photographs are in the house, examine them and see if you can detect this night-gowned child that is whispering in my ear. There are 3 different negatives, but the child is in them all. 6 months later, the photo was reproduced in the December 8th issue of Harper's Weekly, alongside a pen and ink sketch by illustrator L.J. Bridgman. Captured the musing sage and the accidental little girl in the pillow. The piece also includes Bridgman's short and altogether dreadful poem entitled To Mark Twain. Is it strictly a secret the little maid tells? as she mingles her hair with your own? If it isn't, I'm sure there are lots of your friends who are hoping you'll let it be known. Is she haply a muse, just a little girl muse, who helps out while her mother is snoozing? Groan, feel free to groan at the rhyme. Why, of course she's a muse. She was caught in the act, for I certainly found her amusing. A colorized version of this same photograph, made into a triptych with 2 painted scenes of iconic landscapes closely associated with Mark Twain's work, the Mississippi River and the American West, appeared in a lavishly illustrated art monthly called the Burr Macintosh magazine in December 1906, entitled Mark Twain on his 70th birthday, Still at Work. And this really isn't a joke. I mean, that's the point I'm trying to make. I mean, this is actually where he was working. Clement sent a copy of this print to Henry Huddleston Rogers' wife, Emily, soon after. And if you look at the handwritten note on top, inscribed with the message, "Dear Mrs. Rogers, find the little child whispering in my ear." The image in the poem were later made into a color postcard by Raphael Tuck and Sons and sold widely in both the United States and abroad. This optical illusion, however sentimental, literalizes Mark Twain's notion of an unconscious writing process in which he served as the amanuensis of his novels and short stories rather than their origin. Up until the time of his death, he insisted, "During a stretch of 35 years, I exercised my pen in my trade of authorship in the summertime and in the summertime only. I worked 3 months in the year and amused myself in other ways during the other 9. My life for the past 35 years and more has really been nothing more or less than one long holiday, with 3 months scribbling in each year, which other people dignified with the great name of work, but which to me was not work at all, but only play, delicious play." For Mark Twain, the intoxicating deliciousness of play was predicated upon physical repose in a tranquil environment where his imagination could be unleashed, allowing him to enter a realm of rich sensory possibility, free of constraint and propriety, where his restless, ever-curious mind could wander bondless and unfettered. Thank you.